It started on a quiet, sunlit morning in late May. One of those mornings where the world feels peaceful, predictable, and perfectly ordinary. Birds chirped over the neat rows of houses in Crest, a suburban neighborhood that looked like it had been pulled straight from a postcard. Every lawn trimmed to perfection, every driveway pressure washed weekly, and every resident silently competing for who could appear the most put together. But just beneath the surface, tension always lingered, the kind of suburban tension born from too much pride and too many unwritten rules. And that morning, the balance of Crest was about to tilt. For years, Ethan Miller had been one of the quiet, unassuming residents. He kept to himself, paid his dues to the HOA on time, and took care of his property. He wasn't flashy or showy. But when his company went fully remote, he decided to bring a bit of adventure into his life. Instead of turning his spare bedroom into a home office like everyone else, Ethan bought something different, a 32-foot RV, a pristine, silver, and white Class C motorhome. He had always dreamed of taking road trips and exploring the country. But until then, it sat neatly on the right side of his driveway, plugged in, immaculately maintained, ready for the day he'd finally hit the open road. At first, the neighbors didn't seem to care. For weeks, people waved as they walked by, curious but polite. Kids would slow down to stare at the massive vehicle gleaming in the morning sun. But curiosity has a way of turning into resentment in a neighborhood obsessed with uniformity. And soon the complaints began. It started subtly. A few murmured comments about how unsightly it looked or how it didn't fit the character of the community. Then, one morning, Ethan found a note tucked beneath his windshield wiper. It was anonymous, printed on white paper, the kind of note that reeks of cowardice and passive aggression. It claimed the RV was a violation of HOA policy and demanded its removal within 72 hours. Ethan knew the rules well. He had read every page of the HOA's bylaws when he first moved in. The only restriction about vehicles stated that no non-operational or unlicensed vehicles could be kept on the property. His RV was both registered and insured. It broke no rule. But in neighborhoods like Crest, rules didn't always matter as much as reputation. Within days, the HOA president, a woman named Cheryl Hastings, the kind of person who wore her authority like a crown, sent him an official notice. It was written in formal language but dripped with personal disdain. The letter claimed that the RV was a disruption to the visual harmony of the neighborhood. That phrase stuck with Ethan. Visual harmony. It was laughable, really. As if his presence was a discordant note in Cheryl's perfectly orchestrated suburban symphony. At first, he ignored it, confident in his right to keep the RV where it was. But Cheryl was not the type to be ignored. Soon, she began to escalate. She started taking photos, standing in the middle of the sidewalk with her phone angled toward his driveway. Sometimes she brought other HOA members with her, as if building a case. One afternoon, Ethan came home to find a measuring tape left in his yard. Someone had apparently been checking distances, perhaps to see if the RV violated a setback rule. Then came the fines. The first was small, $50, then $100, then $200, each one justified under vague wording like non-compliance with HOA directives. Ethan appealed every one of them, but the board, unsurprisingly, voted against him. The pettiness didn't stop there. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact. Cheryl made sure of that. She spread whispers about how Ethan's brisore was bringing down property values. She called it a nuisance. She even hinted that it might be unsafe, as if his RV were some lurking threat instead of a parked vehicle. Still, Ethan refused to back down. But the turning point came one evening when he returned from a grocery run to find a notice taped to the RV's door. Final warning. The HOA threatened to tow it if it wasn't removed within 7 days. Something inside him snapped that night. He stood in the driveway, staring at the notice fluttering in the breeze, the golden sunset glinting off the RV's windows. This wasn't just about a vehicle anymore. It was about control. About one person's obsession with perfection crushing someone else's freedom. And Ethan decided, right then and there, that if Cheryl wanted to play games, he'd play better ones. Instead of getting rid of the RV, he began transforming it. He spent the next few weeks meticulously converting the interior, removing seats, installing a sleek desk, adding soundproofing panels, LED lighting, and a high-speed internet connection. It became more than just a vehicle. It became his sanctuary, his workspace, his rebellion. He even added small touches outside. a wooden deck platform that folded down from the side, potted plants, and a retractable awning. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the RV slowly evolved from eyesore to masterpiece. By the time Ethan finished, it wasn't just an RV. It was the most unique home office Maple Crest had ever seen, and perfectly legal, because every single modification still complied with county code. And since it was registered, insured, and operational, there wasn't a single thing the HOA could do to stop him. At least, that's what he thought. When Cheryl saw the final result, her outrage was palpable. Her mission had failed, her authority undermined. And if there was one thing an HOA president couldn't stand, it was losing control. She wasn't done. Not yet. And as the sun set over Maple Crest that evening, Ethan didn't realize that the real battle, the one that would turn his driveway into a war zone of rules, fines, and revenge, was only just beginning. The transformation of Ethan's RV had become the talk of Maple Crest. For weeks, curious neighbors slowed their walks to catch glimpses of the sleek workspace gleaming under the morning sun. The white panels reflected the light like polished marble, and at night, the soft blue glow from the tinted windows gave it an almost futuristic look. To most people, it was impressive, creative even. But to Cheryl Hastings, the HOA president, it was an open challenge. She had built her reputation on control, on being the one who set the tone for the community. Every flower bed, every fence post, every shade of paint had to meet her invisible standard of perfection. And now, sitting in the middle of her carefully curated world, was a rolling monument to defiance. At first, she tried to pretend it didn't bother her. But Cheryl wasn't wired to ignore what she couldn't control. So she struck back, quietly, and at first, indirectly. The harassment began with paperwork. Ethan started receiving letters weekly from the HOA office, requests for inspection, notices about potential safety hazards, and warnings about home-approved external structures. Each letter carried the same tone, vague accusations dressed in bureaucratic formality. Then came the inspectors. Within 2 weeks, city officials arrived at his home, not once but 3 times. They cited anonymous complaints about zoning violations, improper utility hookups, and even noise. Each time, the officials left empty-handed, confirming that Ethan's setup was entirely within legal limits. But Cheryl wasn't after justice. She was after exhaustion. She wanted to wear him down, piece by piece. When the official route failed, she turned to the neighbors. Subtle gossip replaced formal complaints. She claimed that Ethan's RV was attracting pests, that it was leaking fluids into the driveway, that it was lowering property values. Before long, even neighbors who had once admired Ethan's creativity started to distance themselves. The isolation grew. Delivery drivers left packages farther from the house, as if afraid of being caught near him. Children who used to wave when he worked in his yard now hurried past, glancing nervously at the RV. The once friendly neighborhood had turned cold. Still, Ethan refused to bend. He doubled down on his work, pouring his focus into the projects inside the RV. He filmed remote meetings, managed clients, and even built a small following online after posting a photo of his setup with the caption, "When the HOA hates your office, but it's better than theirs." The post went viral. Thousands of people shared it, leaving comments like, "This man's living the dream," and "HOs always find new ways to ruin fun." The attention should have felt gratifying. But Cheryl saw it as humiliation. To her, Ethan's viral post wasn't just a post. It was rebellion broadcast to the world. She began to treat it like a personal attack, and from that point on, everything she did came from spite. The next wave of retaliation hit harder. Late one night, Ethan awoke to find his RV covered in flyers, cheap printouts accusing him of being a rule breaker, and a nuisance. They had been taped across the window's windshield, and even the mailbox. He spent an hour tearing them off, realizing they had been spread to several nearby houses too. The next morning, Cheryl called for an emergency HOA meeting. It was thinly veiled as a community safety discussion, but everyone knew it was about Ethan. She brought printed photos of his RV, screenshots of his viral post, and excerpts from HOA bylaws. Twisting every clause she could make it sound like his workspace was a threat to neighborhood order. Her motion, to declare the RV a temporary structure that required removal or face escalating fines. But Ethan was prepared. He had anticipated her move and consulted a lawyer weeks earlier. His attorney sent a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA, warning that any further harassment or unjust fines would result in legal action. The letter spread through the community like wildfire. Some residents, tired of Cheryl's overreach, began to question her authority for the first time. A few even spoke privately to Ethan, quietly thanking him for standing up to her. But Cheryl didn't back down. When she couldn't win legally, she turned emotional, using fear as her weapon. She claimed Ethan's RV was, on accident, waiting to happen, that the power cords were fire hazards, that his unauthorized work setup might violate the community's insurance coverage. At one point, she even called the fire department, reporting a potential electrical issue. When the firefighters arrived, they inspected the RV and found nothing wrong. But the spectacle, flashing lights, uniformed officers, and neighbors gathering to stare, was exactly what Cheryl wanted: embarrassment, humiliation, public pressure. For a brief moment, Ethan almost considered moving the RV to storage just to end the chaos. But every time he thought about giving in, he remembered that this wasn't about a vehicle anymore. It was about freedom, about the right to live without constant interference from someone obsessed with control. So he held his ground. Weeks passed. The HOA fines stopped temporarily, but the cold stares didn't. Maple Crest had become divided, half the neighborhood silently rooting for Ethan, the other half clutching their HOA rulebooks like shields. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. Ethan came home from a quick run to find his RV door ajar. Inside, papers were scattered. His equipment had been moved. Nothing was stolen, just disturbed. Someone had clearly entered without permission. He called the police immediately, but with no witnesses and no signs of forced entry, they could do little. It wasn't a random break-in. It was intimidation. Someone, likely from the HOA's inner circle, had wanted to send a message: "You're not welcome here." That night, sitting inside the RV with only the soft hum of his computer fans breaking the silence, Ethan realized that this battle had gone beyond property lines. It was personal now, a test of endurance, will, and dignity. And as he looked out the window, across the dark street toward Cheryl's perfectly trimmed lawn, he made a quiet decision. He wouldn't just defend himself anymore. He would fight back. And this time, not just with words. After the break-in, something changed in Ethan. What had started as a petty neighborhood dispute had crossed into personal violation. His RV, his sanctuary, had been invaded. The untouched valuables confirmed it wasn't theft. It was a message. Someone wanted to scare him. But fear was the one thing Ethan refused to feel. The next morning, he decided he was done reacting. From now on, he would document everything. He installed security cameras, not just around his house, but directly facing the street. Small, nearly invisible cameras that blended with the trim. He even placed one inside the RV, positioned toward the door. Every movement, every car, every person who walked past would now be captured. For days, nothing happened. Cheryl seemed quieter, the HOA unusually silent. But silence in Maple Crest rarely meant peace. It was the kind of quiet that built before another storm. Then, late one evening, while reviewing footage from the cameras, Ethan found what he was looking for. At 2:14 a.m., two shadowy figures appeared at the edge of his driveway. The footage was grainy but clear enough. One of them was unmistakably Cheryl Hastings. She stood in front of the RV, flashlight in hand, peering inside through the window. The other figure, a man, seemed to be holding a clipboard, jotting notes. They lingered for nearly 10 minutes before walking away. Ethan leaned back in his chair, anger burning through the calm exterior he had maintained for weeks. She wasn't just spying, she was documenting. Trying to gather evidence to use against him, sneaking onto private property in the dead of night. The next morning, he sent copies of the footage to his lawyer. Within hours, the lawyer filed a formal complaint against Cheryl and the HOA board, citing trespassing, harassment, and defamation. But Ethan didn't stop there. He decided to bring the truth into the light. He began compiling everything, every fine notice, every letter, every recorded inspection visit. He printed timestamp screenshots and cross-referenced them with the HOA's own bylaws. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Cheryl had been bending the rules for years, using interpretations of HOA policy to control anyone who challenged her. He found records of previous disputes. A neighbor fined for hanging solar lights, another for painting a door slightly off the approved shade. Each one followed the same path: complaint, fines, intimidation, silence. Ethan realized his situation wasn't unique. It was systemic. So, he began talking to people. Quietly at first, a conversation by the mailbox, a chat during a morning walk. Slowly, stories started to spill out. An older couple on Birch Lane admitted Cheryl had once threatened to report them for an unauthorized garden shed. A single mother confessed she'd paid nearly $1,000 in fines for leaving her trash cans visible one day too long. Ethan recorded their testimonies with permission. Piece by piece, he built a case, not just for himself, but for everyone Cheryl had bullied into silence. The turning point came when he discovered something buried deep in county records. Cheryl had been using HOA funds to pay for private consulting services, including landscaping companies owned by her cousin. It was corruption disguised as policy enforcement. Armed with this information, Ethan contacted a local journalist who specialized in community exposés. She listened carefully, intrigued by the idea of a suburban power figure misusing her authority. When Ethan showed her the surveillance footage and the financial records, she agreed to investigate further. The reporter's questions started to ripple through Maple Crest. Residents noticed unfamiliar cars parked near the HOA office. Some received polite emails from the journalist requesting comment. And as whispers turned into rumors, Cheryl's once firm grip on the neighborhood began to loosen. Still, Cheryl didn't go quietly. She called an emergency community meeting, insisting that Ethan's accusations were false, that he was slandering the HOA for personal gain. But when Ethan showed up with printed copies of the trespassing footage and financial records, the tone shifted. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply placed the evidence on the table for everyone to see. Whispers filled the room. People who had feared Cheryl for years suddenly saw her differently. Her face went pale, her usual confidence replaced by visible panic. The board voted to suspend her temporarily while an investigation took place. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was the first real crack in her armor. Over the next week, things moved quickly. The journalist published her article, HO President Accused of Abuse of Power and Misuse of Funds. The story spread online like wildfire. Social media picked it up, local TV ran the headline for days. Cheryl became the symbol of everything people hated about HOA overreach, and Ethan became the quiet hero who finally stood up. Neighbors who had once avoided him now knocked on his door to thank him. Some brought food, others offered help. It was as if the entire neighborhood had collectively exhaled after years of tension. But victory, Ethan knew, was rarely clean. Cheryl, cornered and furious, wasn't done yet. She still held influence with certain board members and was determined to salvage what power she could. Behind the scenes, she began filing complaints against Ethan to the city. Noise violations, zoning violations, even false reports of unlicensed operation. Each one was dismissed, but they came in waves designed to wear him down. And then came the most unexpected twist. A legal notice from Cheryl's attorney, claiming defamation and emotional distress. Ethan's lawyer handled it quickly, but it confirmed one thing: Cheryl wasn't giving up. The battle had moved beyond the HOA. It was now a fight of reputation, law, and endurance. Yet, despite the chaos, something had changed in Maple Crest. For the first time, people weren't afraid. They questioned authority. They stood together. Ethan's RV, once a source of controversy, had become a symbol of defiance. A reminder that individuality could survive even in the most rigid of places. And as the dust settled and spring melted into summer, Ethan sat inside his RV office one quiet evening, the glow of his monitors reflecting off the polished chrome. Outside, the neighborhood was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt earned. Still, deep down, he knew Cheryl wouldn't fade quietly. People like her never did. And the next move she made would be her most desperate and her most dangerous. By midsummer, Maple Crest no longer felt like the quiet, orderly neighborhood it once pretended to be. The manicured lawns were still trimmed, the houses still spotless, but beneath the perfection lay something fractured. A collective awareness that the illusion of control had been shattered. And at the center of that fracture stood two names, Ethan Miller and Cheryl Hastings. The journalist's story had exposed far more than corruption. It had peeled back the false calm that Cheryl had maintained for years. Residents who once feared speaking up began to talk, first in whispers, then openly. Meetings turned tense, phone calls were recorded, and the HOA office became a revolving door of angry homeowners demanding accountability. The board's temporary suspension of Cheryl quickly became permanent when the county launched an audit of HOA finances. For the first time in her reign, Cheryl wasn't the one giving orders, she was the one under scrutiny. But power, once tasted, rarely releases its hold easily. Cheryl disappeared from public view for several weeks after the article went live. Her car was gone, her front porch light stayed off, and her mailbox overflowed with letters she never collected. Some thought she'd moved away in shame. Others assumed she was quietly planning her next move. They were right about the latter. One morning, as Ethan sat in his RV office reviewing a new set of client proposals, an email alert popped up. It was from a local TV producer. They were doing a follow-up story about the HOA scandal, and Cheryl had agreed to an interview. When the segment aired that evening, the neighborhood gathered around their screens. Cheryl sat before the camera, her tone measured, her appearance carefully rehearsed. She denied the allegations, dismissed the evidence as misunderstandings, and painted herself as a victim of targeted harassment from a disgruntled homeowner. She even claimed the trespassing footage was taken out of context, suggesting she was performing a routine inspection. Then, she said Ethan's name, repeatedly. She accused him of launching a smear campaign, of rallying neighbors against her, of destroying her reputation. The reporter pressed her for proof, but Cheryl's answers were vague, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Still, for those who wanted to believe her, it was enough to sow doubt. By the next morning, Ethan's inbox was flooded again, messages from reporters, legal notices, and most disturbingly, anonymous hate mail. Someone even left a note on his driveway scrawled in red marker. "Traitor. You ruined our neighborhood." It was the start of the backlash. While many residents still supported him, a small but vocal group, loyal to Cheryl or simply resistant to change, began pushing back. They accused him of making Maple Crest look bad, of airing dirty laundry to outsiders. Tension bled into every street. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when Ethan walked by, and the once friendly wave from across the yard disappeared entirely. For a while, he questioned if it had been worth it. The exposure had brought truth, yes, but it had also brought chaos. The peace he'd fought for was now buried under division. And through it all, Cheryl watched from the sidelines, quietly pleased to see the neighborhood turn on itself. But Ethan wasn't done. He knew Cheryl's media stunt wasn't about vindication. It was about control. She wanted to rewrite the narrative, to turn public opinion into her weapon. So, he decided to counter her in the one way she couldn't manipulate: transparency. He posted a detailed online report, a public document outlining everything, from the original RV complaints to the evidence of trespassing and financial misuse. He redacted personal information, but he included copies of letters, timestamps, and screenshots of county filings. He didn't add commentary or accusation, only facts. Within hours, the post spread, local forums picked it up, then regional news outlets. And when the same journalist who'd broken the first story saw the update, she released a follow-up piece titled, "The HOA Scandal Deepens. New Evidence Surfaces Against Former President." This time, there was no spin Cheryl could apply. The evidence spoke for itself. The backlash shifted again. Residents who had doubted Ethan began to apologize, some publicly. Support poured in from outside communities, from people who had fought similar HOA abuse elsewhere. Ethan even received offers to speak at local homeowner workshops, invitations he politely declined. He hadn't done any of this for fame. But Cheryl wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, she filed a lawsuit against the HOA itself, claiming wrongful termination and character defamation. She demanded reinstatement and damages. It was an act of pure spite, one last attempt to assert dominance, to remind everyone she could still make noise. The board, under new leadership, responded swiftly. They filed a countersuit citing breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. The case quickly drew public attention, transforming the quiet suburban conflict into a full-blown legal drama. Cameras occasionally appeared near the entrance to Maple Crest, capturing snippets of an otherwise ordinary neighborhood now known as the HOA war zone. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to keep his life as normal as possible. He continued working inside his RV, the same space that had started it all. Ironically, the structure that Cheryl had once deemed unacceptable now symbolized independence and perseverance. The neighbors began to treat it differently, too. The same people who once frowned at it now saw it as a symbol of victory. Proof that individuality could survive even in a neighborhood ruled by conformity. But not everyone was ready to move on. One night, as summer waned into fall, Ethan heard a loud noise outside, the sharp crack of something hitting metal. He rushed out to find one of his RV's windows shattered. Lying on the ground beneath it was a rock, wrapped in paper. The note read simply, "You should have left when you had the chance." It was a chilling reminder that while the system had turned against Cheryl, the hatred she'd planted still lingered. Ethan reported it, but no one was caught. The security footage showed only a shadowy figure in a hoodie sprinting into the darkness. That night, sitting in the glow of his monitor, he realized the fight wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about resilience. He'd stood against manipulation, corruption, and fear. But the scars left behind, the tension, the mistrust, the paranoia, would take time to fade. The court date for Cheryl's lawsuit loomed on the horizon. It would be the final showdown, the moment where everything would either collapse or come full circle. Ethan didn't know how it would end. But he did know one thing for sure. Whatever the outcome, he wouldn't let anyone take his peace again. And as the wind rustled through the trees outside, and the faint reflection of the RV shimmered in his window, he prepared himself for what was to come. The battle had started with a complaint about an RV, but now it had become something far greater, a fight for freedom, dignity, and truth. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, sterile, official, and heavy with the weight of conflict. It was the kind of place where truth often blurred with presentation, and reputation could crumble with a single poorly chosen word. For Ethan, walking into that building felt surreal. Months ago, he had been an ordinary homeowner, quiet, reserved, more interested in his backyard than in politics or property disputes. Now his name was at the center of a legal storm that had drawn attention far beyond Crest. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited like vultures. Reporters called out questions, snapping photos as Cheryl stepped from her car in a tailored suit and practiced expression. She moved with poise, or the closest imitation of it she could manage, greeting her attorney with a tight nod before glancing briefly toward Ethan. There was no acknowledgement between them, only silence sharpened by months of hostility. Inside, the proceedings began with the cold efficiency of routine. Cheryl's lawyer presented her as the victim, a misunderstood leader unfairly ousted from her role, vilified by gossip, and a vindictive homeowner. She claimed the financial irregularities were simple accounting errors and that the trespassing footage had been taken out of context. But as her attorney spoke, the truth began to unravel. The AOA's legal team, backed by new leadership, came armed with evidence, documents, recordings, witness statements. They revealed a pattern of misconduct stretching back years: missing funds, unauthorized fines, personal expenses billed to the association. Each new revelation felt like a slow, deliberate dismantling of the empire Cheryl had built. Ethan sat quietly through it all. He wasn't there to celebrate her downfall, only to witness the conclusion of something that had consumed far too much of his life. When his turn to testify came, the courtroom hushed. He recounted the beginning, the complaint about his RV, the letters, the threats, the night Cheryl had trespassed onto his property. He described how the situation had escalated beyond reason, how it had transformed from a simple disagreement into an abuse of authority. He spoke without bitterness, only clarity. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing toward Cheryl, whose composure had begun to crack. Her lips tightened, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Every word Ethan spoke chipped away at the mask she had so carefully constructed. Then came the cross-examination. Cheryl's attorney tried to paint Ethan as a provocateur, someone who had exaggerated his grievances for attention. But each question only highlighted how baseless their defense was. The facts spoke louder than rhetoric. When the HA's accountant testified next, the real blow landed. They presented spreadsheets and receipts showing thousands of dollars unaccounted for, diverted through false invoices. One payment trail even led directly to Cheryl's personal bank account. The courtroom murmured. Cheryl's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. For the first time, Cheryl's mask shattered completely. Her hands trembled. The confidence that once commanded fear in Crest was gone, replaced by something brittle and small. The hearing continued for hours, but the outcome had already taken shape. When the judge finally recessed for the day, the consensus was clear. Cheryl had lost control, both of her story and her legacy. Outside, the media swarmed again. Cameras turned toward Ethan, but he kept walking head down, ignoring the flashes. He wasn't interested in interviews or headlines. The victory he wanted wasn't public. It was personal. That evening, he returned to his RV. The familiar hum of the computer greeted him, the soft glow of his workspace spilling across the driveway. It was peaceful again, almost quiet. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the day sink in. For months, this small space had been his refuge and his battleground. Every email, every plan, every act of defiance had started here. It was more than a converted vehicle now. It was the symbol of everything he'd fought for: independence, resilience, truth. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't over. Cheryl still had one more card to play. 2 weeks later, the verdict was delivered. The judge ruled against Cheryl on every count. Her claims were dismissed, her countersuit denied. The HOA's countersuit, however, was allowed to proceed. She faced fines, restitution, and the possibility of criminal investigation for financial misconduct. The news spread quickly. The same local station that had once interviewed her now aired footage of her walking out of court, avoiding questions, her head low. It was the end of her reign, but not without collateral damage. The neighborhood remained divided. Some residents celebrated the verdict as justice long overdue. Others still resented the publicity, claiming Ethan's actions had tarnished the community's image. The tension lingered, invisible but palpable, like static in the air. Ethan didn't engage. He had learned that peace didn't come from convincing others. It came from knowing you had done what was right. Still, there were reminders everywhere of how far things had gone. The shattered window on his RV had long been repaired, but he couldn't forget the sound of that rock hitting metal, or the note that came with it. He had thought that standing up to corruption would bring closure. Instead, it had revealed how fragile order could be when built on fear. Late one night, as he stepped outside for air, he saw something unexpected: a small envelope taped to the RV door. There was no name on it, just the word "sorry." Inside was a short handwritten letter. The words were shaky, unsure. The writer, an anonymous neighbor, admitted they had once sided with Cheryl. They apologized for the way they had treated him, for believing the lies, for staying silent when things got ugly. The letter ended with one simple line: "You made this place better, even if it doesn't feel like it yet." Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. For the first time in months, he smiled. It wasn't vindication. It was understanding, the kind that grows quietly after the noise fades. Maple Crest was changing, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. And as autumn leaves began to fall, painting the streets gold and crimson, Ethan found himself at peace in the most unexpected way. He had never meant to start a revolution. He had only wanted to keep his RV. But sometimes, the smallest act of defiance can unravel the largest lies. The courtroom had closed one chapter. But a new one, quieter, freer, was just beginning. Winter came quietly to Maple Crest that year. The once lush lawns turned pale beneath frost, the trees stood bare, and the air carried that stillness that only arrives after a long storm. It was as if the neighborhood itself was exhaling, tired, worn, but finally at peace. Ethan had settled into a new rhythm. The chaos of the past year had receded, replaced by a calm steadiness. His RV office, once the subject of endless complaints, meetings, and fines, now stood as an accepted, almost admired fixture of the Col de Sac. The polished silver exterior gleamed under the morning light, and the faint hum of his work computer echoed through its interior like a heartbeat. To outsiders, it was just a converted motorhome. To Ethan, it was proof that resilience could outlast persecution. The HOA had undergone a transformation as well. After the court's ruling, Cheryl's name was permanently removed from all association documents. A new president, a younger and far more transparent resident named Daniel, was elected. Under his leadership, meetings became open, financial records were shared, and the atmosphere shifted from fear to cooperation. No one spoke Cheryl's name openly anymore, but her shadow lingered in the unspoken lessons. Every rule, every discussion, every vote now carried a sense of accountability, a quiet reminder of what unchecked authority could do. Ethan rarely attended meetings, though he received personal invitations each month. He preferred to stay focused on his business, his work expanding steadily since the local news exposure. Companies admired his independence, his calm persistence in the face of adversity. What began as a simple freelance project from his driveway had evolved into a small consultancy, one that operated entirely from within the RV that had caused all the trouble. There was a poetic symmetry in that. The very thing his neighbor tried to destroy had become the foundation of his success. Every so often, Ethan would see Cheryl's old house, now sold, its new owners blissfully unaware of the drama that had once unfolded there. The shutters were painted a bright blue, the lawn immaculate, the porch lined with flowers. Life, it seemed, had moved on, But not everyone could. One afternoon, while Ethan worked on a client presentation, he noticed a familiar car idling across the street. It was older, worn down, the paint faded. He recognized it instantly, Cheryl's car. She didn't step out. She just sat there, engine running, watching. For a long minute, neither of them moved. Then she drove away slowly, turning the corner and disappearing beyond the gate. Ethan didn't feel anger, only an odd, distant pity. She had lost everything she tried to control. The following week, a letter arrived from the county clerk's office. Official confirmation that Cheryl's appeals had been denied. The AOA's countersuit settlement would stand. It was finally, definitively over. He read the letter twice, then placed it in the same drawer where he kept the anonymous apology note. Together, they told the whole story, one born from conflict, ending in clarity. For the first time in a long while, Ethan stepped away from his desk and took a walk through the neighborhood. He passed homes that had once glared at him through closed blinds. Now, people waved. Some even stopped to chat. Conversations were tentative at first, but genuine. Neighbors relearning how to talk without suspicion. The frost on the lawn sparkled under the soft sun. The air was crisp and full of possibility. The community had changed, and so had Ethan. He was no longer the quiet man who kept to himself. He had found his voice, and in doing so had reminded others that silence can be its own kind of surrender. Weeks later, the local newspaper ran a small human interest story about Crest's transformation. The headline read, "From Conflict to Community. How One Neighborhood Learned to Listen." Ethan's name appeared only once, briefly mentioned as the homeowner whose determination sparked change. That was exactly how he wanted it. Understated, humble, but they're in the record all the same. In the evenings, he would often sit just outside his RV, sipping coffee, watching the lights flicker on across the street. There was no longer tension in those small moments, only peace. And yet, beneath that peace, he understood something deeper. It wasn't just about winning a battle against an overreaching HOA. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without fear, to live authentically, even when others demanded conformity. The RV stood as a symbol of that truth. Freedom made tangible. Defiance turned into productivity. It had been mocked, targeted, and nearly torn from him, but now it was simply part of the landscape. No longer controversial, just a home. One evening in early spring, as he worked late, he heard a soft knock on the RV door. When he opened it, Daniel, the new HOA president, stood there with a folder in hand. He smiled and handed it over. Inside was a document, an official amendment to the HOA's regulations, signed and sealed. The new clause read, "Residents may use their personal property, including vehicles and accessory structures, for home-based work, provided it does not pose safety or environmental concerns." Creativity, independence, and entrepreneurship are encouraged as part of community values. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "This started because of you. Thanks for proving that rules should serve people, not the other way around." Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. When Daniel left, he placed the amendment alongside the other letters in his drawer. 3 pieces of paper, each marking a turning point: conflict, apology, resolution. He closed the drawer, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The night air was cool and clear. Stars shimmered above the rooftops, and the faint hum of distant traffic blended with the rustle of leaves. For the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood was quiet, truly quiet. No more letters, no more threats, no more fear. Just peace, and as Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets, gazing at the RV that had started it all, he smiled. He had won, not through revenge or defiance, but through endurance. He had faced down power, and in the end, had turned conflict into change. The RV's lights glowed softly against the night, casting a warm reflection across the driveway. A beacon of quiet rebellion, now transformed into hope. Crest would never be the same again. And maybe that was exactly what it needed.